بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to a new lecture in this unit, and in this lecture we will begin a new chapter, the chapter of courts and testimony. And in this we are also embarking on a new basically section of Islamic law. This is really sensitive stuff. This is where we leave, private law and we enter into the public sphere. So to make sense of this chapter, which is the penultimate chapter, which we won't get through all of it, we'll get through most of it, but not all of it. It's important that we keep in mind always, every lecture, and I'll probably be repeating this, but we want to keep in mind that we are leaving the private sphere to the public sphere. And what that means is that when we enter into the public sphere, we are talking about government, we are talking about the state, we are talking about the rule of law, we are talking about judgeship, ifta, the process of giving ifta by muftis. And all of this is predicated on a type of political environment that allows this. So this is not something that we're going to read it and we're just going to go out and do it, like sit in the local mosque and do it. We can't do that. We have to have an apparatus, a state apparatus, through which we are functioning. So in today's lecture, I will spend quite a bit of time, probably in the first clip, kind of expanding on what I just said. Why is this quote unquote sensitive? It's not sensitive in a bad way. It's sensitive because we're dealing with a serious matter, as you will see from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, dealing with the conditions of being a judge and the enormity of being a non-qualified judge, etc. There's a big moral stain to that. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that, kind of laying the groundwork. So hopefully this lecture will be a reference point for basically the rest of the sections dealing with courts and testimony. And then we will begin to talk about the conditions of a judge. I think we're going to do like the first 7 or 8. That's how much we'll get through. Some of them are going to be pretty standard, will be pretty quick. Some of them, there's a difference of opinion. But some of them will have kind of a hefty discussion that will take place. So kind of an introductory lecture, and we'll do some of the text. See you back for the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so we begin the way we normally begin, which is to turn to the text itself of أبي شجاع رضي الله عنه. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. كتاب الأقضية والشهادات. ولا يجوز أن يلي القضاء إلا من استكملت فيه 15 خصلة: الإسلام والبلوغ والعقل والحرية والذكورة والعدالة ومعرفة أحكام الكتاب والسنة. Those are the sections that we're going to take today. It sounds like it's little, but remember, we'll have an introduction shortly. So he says, Qadi Abu Shuja' radiallahu anhu says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and the next. Chapter 16, Courts and Testimony. Judges. It is not permissible for one to be appointed a judge unless he has fulfilled 15 conditions. The judge must be a Muslim, be mature, be of sound mind, be free, be male, be upright, and know the rulings from the Quran and the Sunnah. Those are the ones that we read and we'll discuss. In the Hashiyah there are adillah, but let me just see very quickly in the adillah book if there's anything that I want to mention. About the non-Muslim not having a non-Muslim or having to be a Muslim, we have in Surah An-Nisa 141, وَلَنْ يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ سَبِيلًا. Allah Ta'ala will not place a disbeliever over the believer. So that's generally, it's a general principle, and this is one of the manifestations. We've visited this type of ruling in previous discussions. As far as the male being a male, which in the modern fiqh, the modern muftis will debate this. There's a difference of opinion, but our job here is to convey the traditional fiqh. This is a hadith narrated in Bukhari. لَنْ يُفْلِحَ قَوْمٌ وَلَّوْ أمرهم امرأة, a people will not flourish if a woman becomes their leader. This is on the authority of Abi Bakr radiallahu anhu. Now, I should say that this hadith, the reason that there's, maybe I'll just get into it now. The reason there's a difference of opinion is that this hadith is understood to be the supreme ruler, which is the imam, as we've talked about in the discussion of siyasatu sharia, Islamic governance, state governments, Islamic governance, afwan, that the Khalifa, a condition of the Khalifa is the Khalifa be a man. Anything that is less than a Khalifa, which we don't have that position anymore, so basically all heads of state, whether it be a president or a prime minister, king, queen, sultan, sultana, etc., amir, amira, all of these type of positions, these are less than that. So in the modern fiqh, the muftis or the modern interpretation is that, well, this is really about the khilafah, this is not about anything less than that. So there can be women head of state and there can be women judges. In the traditional fiqh, it's as I read it, because when these type of books were codified and written, there was a figurehead type of khalifa. Yeah, okay. In the Adillah book, there's not that much in the stuff that we took. So let's jump in now to the discussion at hand with, hopefully I can do some justice to kind of giving you the necessary background information. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran in Surah Al-Ma'idah verse 49, وَنَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ. So govern them or judge by them or disseminate justice to them with that which Allah Ta'ala has revealed. And then also in Al-Ma'idah 42, فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ, and be equitable in your administration of justice and in your adjudicating cases. So there are the general principles that we find in these Quranic verses and others in the Quran of the importance of courts and adjudicating cases. This is a natural part of the human condition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, and it is also, I mean, it goes without saying, but it's an obligation that we do so based on justice and equity. And for us, justice and equity is that which is going to be defined by the Sharia, the parameters of the Sharia, the general principles of the Sharia, that is. Of course, there's a lot of ijtihad that goes into being a judge, which we'll get into shortly. But the first principles, those are the ones that are laid out in the Quran and the Sunnah. And that is sort of the ceiling for us of how we distribute justice. We also have the hadith in Bukhari and Muslim. إِذَا اجْتَهَدَ الْحَاكِمُ فَأَخْطَأَ. So if the ruler or a judge strives to adjudicate a case and is wrong, فَلَهُ أَجْرٌ. He gets one reward. He gets a reward based on the effort of ijtihad. وَإِذَا أَصَابَ فَلَهُ أَجْرَانِ. And if he is correct in his decision, in his pronouncement, he gets two rewards. And also, which is important, my teachers always mention this extension, as is narrated, the version of the hadith in Hakim, if he is correct, فَلَهُ عَشَرَ أَجْور. He gets 10 rewards. And of course, when you study Sharia and you study Usul al-Fiqh, the jurists will prefer that narration of the hadith, of course, for obvious reasons, so that if you exert your ijtihad and you're wrong, you still get a reward because you exerted your ijtihad. If your ijtihad was based on the requisite skills that are required, which I'll talk about shortly, and if you are right, you get 10 rewards. One for the exertion of ijtihad and 9 for being correct. He quotes the commentary of Muslim by Nawawi radiallahu anhuma, saying that this is in regards to the just ruler or the just judge or the just mujtahid, meaning somebody that is qualified to do that, in opposition to the person who was not qualified to do that. So if somebody is not qualified to be a mujtahid, not qualified to be a judge or a mufti, and they exert their effort, they are sinning, even if they are correct. So there is no reward for them even if they happen to stumble on what is correct. So he says the four, well, this is a nice teaching point. He says, وَقَدْ رُوِيَ الْأَرْبَعَةِ. So the four narrate, meaning not Bukhari and Muslim, because those are the two sihah. So the four, meaning the other ones, Tirmidhi, Nisa'i, Dawood, and Ibn Majah, radiyallahu anhum ajma'een. And likewise, Al-Bayjuri says, it's found in Al-Hakim and Al-Bayhaqi, that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says that the judges are of three types. One of them is in paradise and two of them is in the hellfire. As for the one who's in paradise, فَرَجُلٌ عَرَفَ الْحَقَّ وَقَضَ بِهِ. A man who knows the truth and adjudicated based on the truth. And then as for the two that are in the hellfire, رَجُلٌ عَرَفَ الْحَقَّ وَجَارَ فِي الْحُكْمِ. So a man who knows the truth but was corrupt in the pronouncement, meaning they didn't give the right answer. وَرَجَلَ قَضَى لِلنَّاسِ عَلَى جَهْلٍ. And a person who adjudicates a case based on ignorance. So these are, and the reason I'm going a little slow in this introduction is I want this to sink in, that this is a serious, serious matter. And obviously, this is a commentary on the current situation that we find ourselves in as a global ummah and also as a local, national and local ummah, that unfortunately there are many people that are just ignorant. I mean, most people, I would go as far as to say, most people in the online space, social media space, that are quote unquote, da'is or people of, speaking in the name of Islam, they are ignorant about, they are vastly ignorant about many, many things. They might be right about one or two things, but they're vastly ignorant when it comes to the technical aspects of the Sharia, which is why this whole program exists, so we can kind of fill in this gap. And you can see that this is serious, serious stuff. This is not, it's a bad thing, or, no, you shouldn't do, boo-hoo, you shouldn't do that. The Prophet ﷺ is saying is such a person is in the hellfire. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. Now, there's another hadith. Let me give you two more. This is in Abu Dawood and Tirmidhi, on the authority of Abi Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man ju'ila qadiyan dhubiha bighayri sikeen." Whoever has been made a judge has been killed by other than a knife. So it's the burden of being a judge is so great and so awesome that it's serious. Let me pick this up in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so continuing with some of the hadith that we find, just like setting the stage for what we're talking about. Makhul, one of the great Salaf, he said, لو خيرت بين القضاء والقتل لاخترت القتل. If I was given the option to be a judge or to die, I would choose death. And Al-Bayjuri also points out that both Imam Shafi'i and Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu refused to be judges. So this is serious stuff, is the point. It's a huge burden. It's a position in which you're not going to make any friends, because you have to, in the West they have like a lady justice, which is a lady who has a blindfold, like holding the scales. The idea is that justice is supposed to be blind and there's not supposed to be any bias. In that case, in other words, bil-qist, bil-adl, as the Quran says, you have to be equitable and you have to be just, even if it's against a family member. Like the Prophet ﷺ said, even if my daughter, Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, would steal, I would, exact the had punishment over her. So because of the enormity of it, people like a Shafi'i and a Hanafi, they were just resigned to being, theoreticians and usulis, and they were engaging in absolute ijtihad, which is even a bigger obligation and has a greater reward, but not getting into the weeds. That being said, somebody's got to do it, which is why we talk about it. And there are going to be different versions of it. It's not like you're studying the Sharia as a student or you're like a full-on judge. I mean, there are different like levels and layers. But as you advance in your Sharia career and as you learn Islamic law, people will come to you to ask you questions. So you will be placed in such a scenario and such a situation. So remember these hadith, remember these introductory comments, so that you are not taking it lightly. This is something serious. This is something that should make you sweat. This is something that will make you pause. will say, well, hold on, let me go verify, let me double, triple, quadruple confirm that I am right, etc. Okay, so this is the chapters on judgeship and testimony. So the testimony part will come later, and again, that's another public thing. You know, when you have a witness or you're called to bear testimony in court, you are basically asked to bear witness to the truth because you know lying is a sin, is a major sin. So that will come later. Okay. Now, being a judge or having a judge is a communal obligation, a fardu kifaya, which means that if somebody doesn't do it, then it is going to become an obligation for each person until somebody does it. So just like teaching basic subjects, teaching Arabic, teaching Quran, teaching Hadith, teaching people how to pray, all of these, you know, having cooks, having restaurants, having police, having physicians, engineers, all of these are furud kifaya. They're all communal obligations. A society cannot sustain itself without them. This is in the context of Islamic law. Obviously, this is an example. We're not talking about the other positions, but there are, and maybe it's worth mentioning, there are many books written in the catalog of the Islamic library that talk about quote unquote Islamic positions or positions required in Islamic societies, like some of the ones that I just rattled off. So we're not just limited to judgeship, but obviously because this is a class, this is an entire course or BA program about Islamic law, specifically Shafi'i Islamic law, obviously we're going to talk about being a judge. Now, just to impress upon you how important this is, even if somebody unjust becomes a judge and that's the only judge, you have to follow their pronouncement, because the opposite, having nothing, would create chaos. So even though we said, for example, in the classical fiqh, a woman can't be a judge, he'll say even if it's a woman a judge or a young man is a judge, somebody who's not reached full puberty, and they are placed as a judge for whatever reason, you have to follow their pronouncement. Why? Because the other option is that there will be complete chaos, will be a void and a vacuum. And in this he's quoting Al-Aiz ibn Abd al-Salam in Al-Qawa'id al-Kubra, which is one of the main books of qawa'id, of principles, of legal principles in the Shafi'i madhab. So that's how important it is. Okay. Now let's jump into the text that we read. Okay, I think that's enough by way of kind of introductory stuff. Hopefully you guys get that. So it's not permissible for one to be appointed a judge unless. Now, if somebody's appointed as a judge, which just to complete that thought that I just said, and doesn't fulfill these requirements, we're still going to follow them because there has to be law and order. That's sort of one of the things that he's trying to impress upon us. The first one is Islam. So we are talking about a Muslim judge to mete out the justice and law and order as conceived through Islamic law, which is the interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah. So obviously the person that has to do that has to be a Muslim. It doesn't mean that there can be non-Muslims that are, students of Islamic law. I mean, that's happened in the past. And it's, when I was at Princeton, I studied almost all, not all, but almost all of my professors were non-Muslim. And many of them were very, very well versed in Islamic law. So here he's not talking about theory, we're talking about practice. And that's why I said in the beginning, we're moving from private to public sphere. So here we're talking about the public sphere. So for you to be a judge, an Islamic judge, obviously, to deal with cases and try cases based on Islamic law, the first condition is that you have to be a Muslim. Now, Al-Mawardi says, and this is in the commentary and then in the Hashiyah.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. Could you repeat that?
Excuse me. Al-Mawardi says that there is a habit of non-Muslim minority groups having leaders amongst them. And he says these are leaders, not judges, because the overarching legal system that is going to be used in a Muslim majority context is Islamic law. So later in especially in the Ottoman period, there are millet courts, there are millet systems in which non-Muslim citizens can adjudicate their cases amongst their personal status cases amongst themselves. And this comes from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ when he came to Medina and he established the Wathiqatul Medina. He allowed the Jews to adjudicate their cases amongst themselves as they needed to, unless there was a dispute, in which case they would have to refer to Islamic law. And in that case, we revert to the first condition, is that the judge has to be a Muslim. Okay. And then the second and third is mature and of sound mind. So full maturity is required. The person has to have at least passed the age of puberty, even though there's the age of discernment, when they're very little before the age of puberty. That's like a halfway step. That doesn't count in the case of being a judge. You have to be full mature. Why is that the case? So what is one of the reasons why we can understand that that's the case? Hopefully you will remember way back when we talked about taklif, and we talked about how the age of puberty, the Sharia determines for both boys and girls, or men and women, becomes the age of moral responsibility, is because with the first sexual experience, which is the wet dream, or with a girl experiencing her menses, etc., there is another part of your psyche is active. That there's another whole part of you that you weren't necessarily aware of before, which is that there are do's and don'ts related on the sexual organ, and you're kind of aware of gender relations and then relationships in general, who's your parents, who's your sister, all of those kind of things start to become a part of the consciousness, whereas before that it wasn't even there. And so much of our life is dealing with those types of issues. Not all of it, but some of it, much of it is dealing with those things. So therefore, when the person is at an age of maturity, then they're basically able to be aware 360 degrees of all of the things that one has to deal with in life, which as before that, that wouldn't been able to happen. But like leading the prayer, for example, if somebody is able to lead the prayer, even if they're a young boy, they could, because they don't need to know those other things. So that's why I'm kind of making that distinction. And then sound mind, well, I hope that goes without saying, that someone has to be a sound mind, because you have to be able to hear the evidence and weigh the evidence based on the principles. And we'll pick this up in the next and final clip, inshallah. Okay, in the last clip, we were saying that the conditions are to be a judge, a Muslim, mature, and of sound mind. And then number 4 is to be free. So a slave can't be a judge. I think that's obvious. Because then they have no ownership, and then they have no, basically, freedom to do that. And then being a male. And I said, I think in the introduction, or maybe in the first clip, that this is a difference of opinion kind of in modern fiqh. But our job here, sometimes I emphasize the modern fiqh, like when we talk about transactions and riba. That's so significant that you kind of need to know the traditional stuff, but you kind of need to also know how the modern fiqh is applied. I guess this is one of those too. Because there are female judges in Muslim majority countries. Not many, but there are. But there are Muslim women heads of state. If I'm not mistaken, there have been more Muslim women heads of state in the modern period, like the last 150 years, than in the West. I could be wrong, but there's certainly been a lot. And there's an allowance in the Sharia for that, based on the interpretation of the hadith that we mentioned in the Dalil book, that a people will not thrive or will not succeed if a woman is their leader. That when we analyze the hadith, we analyze it and understand that he's talking about the Khalifa, not anything that's less than a Khalifa. And a judge is certainly less than that. Anyway, the traditional fiqh is that a judge is going to be a man. And for the majority, I think, of the Muslim majority world, that still is the case. Not as a legal condition, but it's just sort of what ends up happening is most judges are men. Okay, and then upright. Al-adala here, upright, that's going to be the same sort of definition that we find when we talk about what is required for a hadith to be transmitted by somebody who's upright. Same thing that we talked about in the commentary of the Bayquniyah, same conditions. As a matter of fact, very shortly in the Haisha, he quotes from the Bayquniyah. And the reason I point these things out is I want you to see how all of these, as you get deeper into each science, they're all sort of talking to each other, sharing from each other, quoting from one another. It's very, very common. So maybe when you started studying, you're seeing everything as a kind of a silo, but really they start out as independent silos, but they're really all going together until it's one thing. When in your mind and in your heart you can understand that all of these sciences is one thing, even things like logic and nahu and so all that stuff, as you see this as one thing, then you're starting to get into the flow and understanding Islam properly. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to give us all of that. Anyway, so upright, meaning you can't do anything that is controversial publicly. So the judge needs to be beyond reproach. And the mu'tamid in the madhab is even if there's something that there's a difference of opinion, but one opinion says that this is a non-upright thing or a thing that is morally reprehensible, the judge has to stay away from it, at least publicly, because you can't be seen to engaging in public things. So that's a serious condition, because the judge has to be respected and has to be able to give their pronouncement and do their judicial thinking without being accused of bias or not being uprightness, etc. And then he says, which is the last one for today's class, is know the rulings of the Quran and the Sunnah. So let me get into that a little bit with the remaining time that we have. Meaning that they have to know the different categories of the rulings that are in the Quran and Sunnah. So what are the rulings? Well, the rulings or the type of things that the judge needs to know are those things that we study in usul al-fiqh. So for example, you need to know that there is something that is am, general, and something that is khas, specific. You have to know that there's something that's mutlaq, absolute, and something that's muqayyad, restricted. You have to know that something is mujmal, whose dalil is not clear, something that is mubayyin, which is the opposite of the mujmal. You need to know that there's a nas, that the text, prima facie meaning of the text is a direct understanding, and that prima facie understanding is the understanding. Things like that. So those are the type of things that we talk about in the first chapter of usul al-fiqh. When it comes to the sunnah, you need to know the mutawatir, the ahad. You need to know the muttasil and the munqata'. These are the types of narrations that we talked about in the Bayquniyah, wal marfu' and the mursal. And he's here, al-Bayjuri is just quoting from al-Bayquniyah. وكل ما لم يتصل بحال إسناده منقطع الأوصال وما أضيف للنبي مرفوع مرسل منه صاحبي سقط, etc. So he's just quoting directly from the Bayquniyah. So now you see why we study those subjects, is that you need to know that those are the different types of hadith. It's not just sahih and da'if. I mean, that's a very I would even go as far as one-dimensional understanding. There's much more that you need to know. That is the hadith connected? Is it mursal? Is it marfu'? Is it maqtu'? Is it ahad? Most hadith are ahad, or is it mutawatir? If it's mutawatir, all bets are off. If it's mutawatir, then it's mutawatir. It is what it is. So, and the stuff that we just talked about in usul, you need to know that there are different types of texts. So if somebody's presenting you with a case, or somebody's asking you a question, whether you're a qadi or a mufti, you need to know in your mind, you have to have that mental map of those categories. And then you got to say, okay, this issue that they're dealing with, is it a clear-cut text, or is it not a clear-cut text? Is it something that's general, or is it specific? Or is it something that is mentioned in the specific but it means something general? Or is it mentioned in general and it means something al-aam, urid bi al-khas, etc. The type of things that we talked about in both the waraqat, and if you've by this time you've gotten hopefully into Lubb al-Usul, we've talked about those things ad nauseum. So when he talks about that, when he mentions the Quran and Sunnah, you have to know those categories. You don't have to know the answer right away, but you have to know those categories so then you can do your due diligence. You can do your ijtihad work. Okay, now, of course, all of this means that the assumption is that the judge is a mujtahid. So there's a little bit of like a tangent here to talk about ijtihad. I'm not going to do a full treatment here because we've done that in usul al-fiqh, or we will do that in usul al-fiqh inshallah. But the highest form of ijtihad as al-ijtihad, or as the mujtahid al-mustaqil, the independent mujtahid. Or al-mujtahid al-muqannan, the one who establishes the laws of usul. Those were the big guys, Imam Abu Hanifa, Shafi'i, Malik, etc. That type of ijtihad doesn't exist anymore. In other words, all of the tools, of interpretive tools that we need, the dala'il al-amma, the general proofs of the Sharia, we have them. Ijma', qiyas, Quran and Sunnah, Amal Ahl al-Madina, al-Istihsan, the ones that we agree on, the ones that we disagree on, they're all there. We've ذهب القسم العقلي, we say the rational categories have been exhausted, more or less, that there's really nothing else to come. But there is an absolute ijtihad, al-ijtihad al-mutlaq, and he quotes الدقيق, Ibn al-Daqiq al-Aid radiyallahu anhu, who says, لا يخلو العصر من المجتهد, that a time will not be without a mujtahid except when we come to the end of the final hour. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. And there is a debate amongst some of the ulama throughout Islamic law, throughout Islamic history, is there ijtihad or not ijtihad? The upshot is there is always ijtihad, because if you just fulfill the conditions, you just do the work. But there might not be a certain type of ijtihad. So sometimes people confuse the absolute establishing mujtahid for absolute ijtihad. There are two different types, al-mustaqil and al-mutlaq. There are two different categories. But because the mustaqil doesn't really exist anymore, we kind of just forget about that term and we just start with al-mutlaq, and then we think when people say there's no more ijtihad, we think it means there's no more mutlaq ijtihad. It's a rare thing, but it exists and it must exist. And then when it comes to the Quran and the Sunnah, he also mentions that the judge does not have to have all of the texts memorized, nor even all of the texts of the verses of the ahkam, the verses in the Quran that deal with Islamic law, which al-Mawardi said are around 500. Between 400 and 500 different ulama have different things depending on which verses count, but I mean a very small subset of the Quran. And when it comes to the hadith, about 2,000 of the hadith deal with the Sharia as well. So those are the main primary texts that the judge / mujtahid is going to have to concern themselves with. Okay, we're going to stop with that one, and then we'll continue the list in the next class. That's enough for today. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's class we began this penultimate chapter to the book, which we will most likely not finish in this unit, but we'll get pretty far into it, on courts, judgeship, and testimony. And we begin by talking about the judges and the conditions for the judge. But before we jumped into that, I did spend quite a bit of time, about a lecture and a half, talking about the sensitivity and the importance of this topic. When I mean sensitivity, just to repeat, I don't mean it's sensitive in a bad way. I just mean that we are now leaving the realm of private law and now we are entering into the public sphere. And when we talk about that, we need to understand that there is all of this is predicated on an operational state. There's a government and that there are courts, and it is the government that gives the courts authority. And the law that is used in the courts, its authority comes from independent law, which is in this case the law of the Quran and the Sunnah, the law of fiqh. That's a distinction I didn't get into, and I realize it now that I'm just mentioning it, so maybe in tomorrow's lecture I will kind of expand upon that, because this is an important distinction that unfortunately most people don't know about. So we spent a lot of time talking about some of the hadith that talk about the seriousness of being a judge, how a judge is a type of mujtahid, and if the judge is not qualified and they engage in adjudicating cases, they're sinning even if they are right. And the Prophet ﷺ said that such a judge would be in the hellfire. May Allah Ta'ala protect us and make us amongst those that are in the paradise, inshallah. So it's serious stuff. And I just wanted to, again, I'm going to keep repeating that this is a serious matter. And A lot of misguidance happens throughout the Muslim community, internationally, nationally, and locally, simply because people are not qualified to do what they're doing. And the whole point of this entire program is to remedy that by giving you guys the knowledge that you need to be informed. And then we began talking about the conditions. The condition is that it has to be a Muslim, the judge has to be a Muslim, has to be mature, has to be of sound mind, has to be old enough, has to be free, and has to be a male. We talked about the difference of opinion. And then we started to get in at the very end of the last clip knowledge of the rules of the Quran and Sunnah and what that means. Basically, they have to have a working knowledge of usul al-fiqh and a knowledge of the subset of the Quran and the Sunnah that deal with Islamic law, which is about 500 verses in the Quran and about 2,000 hadith. That's where we ended, and then in tomorrow's lecture we will continue. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.